Well, good morning. How are you all doing today? I'd like to do a talk today, a discussion about a topic that I think is very, very imperative about our world today that kind of seeps into every aspect of our life. And the title of it is Facing Our Fears, but Not Alone. It starts with a great story that's an old one, but I just love the story because it really talks about fears, what it really is all about. It was a summer night, and it was during a really bad, severe thunderstorm, and a mother was tucking her small son into bed. And she's about to turn the light out, but when he asked in a very trembling voice, "Mommy, will you stay with me tonight?" Smiling, the mother gave him a warm, reassuring hug and said tenderly, "I can't, dear. I have to sleep in Daddy's room." There's a long silence followed by a little broken, shaky voice that says, "The big sissy." It is the most destructive, I think, and motivator we have in our life. It pushes, it pulls, and it stretches us to act out our heroic as well as our most cowardly actions. It forms regrets in our life, from bad decisions to impulsive ones. It opens up untapped resources of fortitude and power. It's a four-letter word that you know so well in your language, and that's fear, as I have said before. We're afraid of failure, so we try harder. We're afraid of loneliness, so we form relationships both good and bad. Fear can make us faster and more accurate from concentration, yet it can make you fumble with doubt. It's like that guy who was out of money and he decided to rob a bank. And because he couldn't think of any other way to get the money, he didn't know anything about robbing banks. And so he practiced what he would say over and over again in rehearsal. So he got a revolver and a sack for money. And then he practiced sticking the sack over the counter and pointing the gun in someone else's faces saying, "Don't mess with me. This is a stick up." When it came time for the real thing, he was really, really nervous. But he was confident that he hit it down pat what he would do. However, when he got into the bank, fear took over. He handed the lady the revolver, pointed the sack at her, and said, "Don't stick with me. This is a mess up." Yes, we could mess up, but at least we try. Fear is a weapon and a tool in our lives. It's a shadow following us to motivate or allow us to give up. It can freeze us up to not even attempt anything, or it can make us try harder to get past it. It's a fight or fear motivator. Our scripture lesson I want to bring up today is from Psalms, the 91st chapter, a few verses out of that, starting with the first verse through the 6th verse, then pick up again in the 9th verse. "As for you, the one who lives in the shelter of the Most High and resides in the protective shadow of the Sovereign One, I say this about the Lord, my shelter and my stronghold, my God in whom I trust. He will certainly rescue you from the snare of the hunter. He will shelter you with his wings. You will find safety under his wings. His faithfulness is like a shield or a protective wall. You need not fear the terrors of the night, the arrows that flies by day, the plagues that stalks in the darkness, or the disease that ravages at noon." And in verse 9, "For you have taken refuge in the Lord, my shelter, the Most High. No illness will come near your home, for he will order his angels to protect you in all you do." Isn't that a strong, strong affirmation when our fears come in the nature of it? Well, let's talk about the nature of fear. In 1933, some of us who were alive then, or at least know our history really well, our nation was in a severe depression. The stock market had crashed 4 years earlier. People had lost their jobs and their homes. Savings were gone. There was no Social Security. People stood in bread lines for food. The threat of starvation and homelessness was constant. Fear pervaded the very atmosphere of our country. The next president was about to take office, and after Franklin D. Roosevelt was sworn in, he gave his inaugural address. And one of the things he said, if you recall, is he tried to bolster the morale of his disheartened countrymen, and has become very immortal in what he said. And he said, "We have nothing to fear but fear itself." Man, what a profound statement. Roosevelt knew what fear can do. It can paralyze us. It causes ambition and courage to just leak out and leaves us without resources to face even the simplest issues of life. So fear is defined as an emotion aroused by a threatening evil or impending pain, accompanied by a desire to avoid or escape it. Apprehension or dread is what we feel when we have fear. But it's a very tricky human emotion. It can paralyze you. It can keep you from your dreams. It can keep you very small. So like fear is like a mighty wind. The wreckage left by the toxic wind of fear is evident everywhere, like a hurricane wind. We're afraid of the unknown, afraid of one another, afraid of poor health, afraid of death, and afraid of what the future holds for our loved ones, our people that we care about, and our communities. Fearing that we won't have enough, we hold tight to what we have and we're reluctant to share. It paralyzes our generosity. Fearing the claims of those who've been excluded or marginalized, we react with anger, resentment, and even violence. You can see how this is pervading our nation even today. But fear can also keep you safe. Fear can be your friend in just the right moments and right doses. But too much of it can kill you. Fear is a natural human emotion, and it's something that everyone experiences in their lifetime. No one's immune to it. What matters most is how you fight your fears and whether you let them affect your life. When you fear the worst will happen, your own thoughts may bring it about, possibly by just kind of an innate action that you have. Fear, as one writer said, is the wrong use of imagination. It is anticipating the worst, not the best that can happen. Now, you may not be calling the word fear in your life. You might call it stress, worry, or panic. But often when we use these words, we're talking about the same emotion, which is fear. When you feel fear, you can experience three types of symptoms. First, unhelpful thoughts, such as thinking everyone around you is criticizing you or something like that, or something bad's going to happen in your life. So, and the word paranoid comes to mind when I said that. Then there's physical symptoms, such as a rapid heartbeat, faster breathing. We kind of break out into sweat and higher blood pressure. And that's your body's fight or flight response. Then there's changes in your behavior, ranging from simple thing as avoiding a fun activity to more serious issues like being afraid to even leave your home. It paralyzes you to want to even socialize. The good news is, though, there are lots of ways to help manage your fears and lots of places to find both in the medical and in the spiritual side. So let's start exploring the difference between healthy and unhealthy fears. So, fear is programmed into your nervous system. It's part of our creation, and it works instinctively from when you are a baby. It gives you the survival instincts you need to keep yourself safe when you find yourself that you're in fear. Some fears are very healthy, as you know. If you see a poisonous snake in your backyard and your fear prompts you to run back into the house and close the door, that's a healthy fear. The feeling of fear is natural, and it helps keep you safe, such as when a bear comes into your house, as it did the other day for us, so you quickly retreat and let the bear alone to wander back out again. But other fears are unhealthy and unnecessary. Sometimes you fear makes you more cautious than you really need to be. For example, the fear of meeting new people. It scares you. It may be intimidating, but meeting new people that isn't a real threat to your safety. The fear is an unhealthy fear, and it stops you from doing things that you otherwise enjoy. So feelings of fear, let's get down into more of the analytical side. Worry or stress can be very upsetting, but they usually pass when the cause of your stress is gone. You won't need to much of fighting your fears here because they don't last very long. They're just a temporary feeling. Anxiety is a more serious condition, though. It's common to be anxious in high blood pressure situations. For example, we have to make a speech in front of a large group of people, or when you have to do something that's totally outside your nature of your confidence level. You might experience fear and stressful anxiety, such as an accident when you have possibly you fall down and you get hurt, or even an auto accident. So these things are something you got to contend with. So an anxiety disorder is different because those anxious feelings are there even when there is no obvious cause. That's a medical issue. Now, a phobia comes to mind here is an irrational fear of certain objects or situations. Did you know that there are over 400 phobias? Some with a phobia can experience intense anxiety when they're exposed to this particular object or situation, or sometimes they just think about it. I mean, like height or being enclosed in areas or a multitude. A few interesting ones that I found in a more humorous way is, have you ever heard of papophobia? Well, that is the fear of the Pope. I did not know there was one. And then there's one, and I'm going to butcher this one, it's a long one, arachibutyrophobia. Well, that's a fear of peanut butter sticking to the roof of one's mouth. I never heard that too. Now, here are two phobias that I have. I'm going to just tell you they are, but you know what they are when I say them. First one is palidophobia. That's the fear of becoming bald, or even people who are bald. I think that's a little too late on that one. Trichophobia for me is the fear of dealing more with hair that's physically falling out. Well, both of these are too late. I've already got those, and I'm past that already. But let's go with what God says about all this. God built into us an emotional response of fear, just as he gave us the ability of love. Not long ago, my wife and I were on a highway, and I was driving when my wife suddenly shouted, "Watch out!" A truck on my right was merging into our lane because the right lane was ending. He was almost on top of us, and I immediately swerved to avoid him. Then I felt a tingling all through my body. Adrenaline had rushed in to help me respond to danger instantaneously. Normal, healthy fear has served me well. When we warn our children to not talk to strangers, not to go with strangers anywhere, that comes from an honest fear of their harm. When we lock our doors and install security systems in our house, it's a wise reaction to the escalating crime in our communities. These kinds of fears are realistic responses to the fact that we live in an imperfect world. We can't control evil people or the ravages of nature. That kind of fear is a gift God instilled within us, and is to our benefit. So God wants to protect, not to imprison us with fear. Fear is part of our Creator's loving provision for us. And properly controlled, fear protects us from harm and motivates us toward a positive action. Now, if you were to see a bear in the woods, you wouldn't go up and pet it. You'd flee as fast as you could. Your sensible fear protects you. Uncontrolled fear, however, can lock us up into an emotional prison and stunt our personal and spiritual growth. Unrestrained fear darkens our lives, it colors everything we do, and it's a huge obstacle to our spiritual health. Now, God's word found in 2 Timothy says this, "For God hath not given us the spirit of fear." And then in 1 John it says, "Perfect love drives out fear." Now, if God doesn't give us a spirit of fear, and we know that he loves us perfectly, then why are we still afraid? How can we be freed from the paralysis of this kind of fear that generates in our life? We must learn to fight fear with fear. Another kind of fear that is an antidote for our uncontrolled fears, and it's called the fear of the Lord. When we have the fear of the Lord, it means that we look upon God with awe and reverence, an attitude accompanied by obedience, knowing, quote from Proverbs, "The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom." A story goes that a mother and her 4-year-old daughter were preparing to retire for the night. The child was afraid of the dark, and the mother on this occasion, alone with the child, felt fearful also. When the light was out, the child caught a glimpse of the moon outside the window. "Mother," she said, "is the moon God's light?" "Yes," said the mother. Well, the next question was, will God put out his light for us to go to sleep? Mother said, "Oh no, my child. God never goes to sleep." The out of simplicity of a child's faith, she said that which gave assurance to even the fearful mother. She said, "Well, as long as God is awake, there's no sense both of us staying awake." I like that. Since God is awake and God is in control and God is guarding us, then we can go to bed without fear. So the fear of God changes the perspective entirely. We're afraid when we're suddenly caught off guard and don't know what to do. We're afraid when our presuppositions and assumptions no longer account for what we're up against, and we don't know what will happen to us. We're afraid when reality, without warning, is shown to be either more or other than we thought it was. In the Hebrew culture and the Hebrew scriptures, the word fear is frequently used in a way that means far more than simply being scared. Fear of the Lord is the stock biblical term for this either sudden or cultivated awareness that the presence or revelation of God introduces into our lives. We're not the center of our existence. We are not the sum total of what really matters. We don't know what's going to happen next. Fear of the Lord keeps us on our toes and our eyes open. Something is going around us and happening around us, and we don't want to miss it. The fear of the Lord prevents us from thinking that we know it all. As long as God is bigger, we fear that awesomeness. That puts it in perspective of who we are and that we have no control of everything around us. But God is at the center of our lives. And if therefore prevents us from closing off our minds or our perceptions from what is new, the fear of the Lord prevents us from acting presumptuously and therefore destroying or violating some aspects of beauty, truth, or goodness that we don't recognize or don't understand. Does that make sense? The fear of the Lord, let me put it into terms here. The fear of the Lord contains us in our fears and our judgments and things of this nature. And if it contains us to know that God has control, God did this, God is part of this, and that gives us that confidence, then it keeps us from messing everything up. It keeps us from jumping in there and trying to solve things that we don't need to solve. That's God's business. The fear of the Lord is fear with the scary element removed. That sums it up. All our lives, we seem to alternate between the fear of people and circumstances and the fear of the Lord. But the more that we fear the Lord and trust His sovereignty, the less we will be at the mercy of all these fears that are needless. It took the patriarch Jacob a lifetime to learn this lesson, and I hope that we can learn to adopt an attitude of fearlessness a little more quickly than he did. So Genesis 27 is a story about Jacob that reveals the flawed relationships in Jacob's family, the family that God chose to be His instrument to bring salvation to the world. Let's take a few moments to read that story, and I'll go over it real quickly here now, but I'll let you read it on your own. You'll see that Isaac, the father, was determined to give God's Abrahamic blessing to his favorite son, Esau. Now, we know the story, so I'll go over it real quickly. Meanwhile, Isaac's wife, Rebekah, knew before her twins were born that God had chosen the younger son, Jacob, to receive the blessing. So Rebekah instructed and conspired with Jacob, who was her favorite, to steal the blessing by disguise and lying to the father. When Esau found out that his mother and brother had plotted against him and robbed him of his birthright, he, quote, in Genesis 27:14, held a grudge against Jacob because of the blessing his father had given him. He said to himself, the days of mourning for my father are near, that I will kill my brother Jacob. Well, Jacob, a man who lived in fear, following the deception, Jacob ran away from home because of the very fear that Esau that would kill him. So from Esau's perspective, such a violent reaction would have been justified. Jacob's guilty conscience confirmed it. But during Jacob's first night on the road, when he lay down some stones to sleep, an amazing thing happened that we know about. The scripture tells us Jacob had a dream in which he saw a ladder or stairway leading from earth to heaven and angels moving up and down it. Above the stairway stood the Lord, and the promises he made Jacob were astonishing. This is what he said. I am the Lord, the God of your father Abraham, and the God of Isaac. I will give you and your descendants the land in which you are lying. Your descendants will be like the dust of the earth, and you will spread out to the west and to the east and to the north and to the south. All peoples on earth will be blessed through you and your offspring. I am with you, and I will watch over you wherever you go, and I will bring you back to this land. I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised you. And that's fantastic. That's an unbelievable prophecy and given by God directive. God confirmed to Jacob that the covenant he had made with his grandfather Abraham will be fulfilled through Jacob's descendants. Now, Jacob had need to lie and deceive to get the blessing because God was already in it. God had always intended to give it to him. But Jacob got ahead of God in his fear. You see where I'm going now? In order for this promise to come true, he could not be killed by Esau. See, that's just not part of, if God said this is the way it's going to be, there's not even a thought process that anything else would happen. So Esau couldn't kill Jacob because God was going to let it. He already made that promise. But Jacob feared anyway. God also promised that he would be with Jacob wherever he went, and he will bring Jacob back to his homeland, where Esau was. So when he awoke from the dream, Jacob realized that God's presence had been there. He said, quote, how awesome is this place? This is none other than the house of God. This is the gate of heaven. So Jacob responded with reverence and genuine fear of God. Oh, there's my example right there. From fear of all of our anxieties and stresses and where it may be, and the scary aspect of it, the fear of the Lord that Jacob finally got to took the scary out of it, and he knew his destiny because God took that uncontrollable fear out of him. So next morning, he built an altar and he made a vow. He said, if God will be with me and watch over me on this journey I am taking, I will give me food and eat, clothes to wear, so that I may return safely to my father's house. Then the Lord will be my God, and this stone that I have set up as a pillar will be God's house, and all that you give me, I will give you a tenth. Notice the if and the then when I just read it. This was a conditional vow. But hadn't God just made unconditional promises to Jacob? Now here's where the human aspect comes in. Yes, but Jacob had a long way to go before he would trust God completely. This was the beginning of his personal walk with God. He was a baby in his faith at this time. This kind of bargaining is so familiar today. We tell the Lord, if you get me out of this situation, I'll trust you more. Or if you heal me, I'll serve you. Or if you'll give me a winning lottery ticket, I'll go help all others who are in need. It's as if we're trying to bribe God to save us from our ups and downs of life. But it's coming and it's rooted in our fears, incompleteness, all those unknowns of life that just dominate us and puts us into that fear. I remember when I was first parachuting, when I was in the Army, and I was in airborne school. When the airplane was flying 1,000 feet in the air and the door came open and the winds whipped through, we were told to stand up. And I mean, our hearts were racing and I knew my blood pressure was high for sure. And we were preparing to exit a perfectly good airplane. I remember standing there looking down, straight down that doorway, and there were no stairs like Jacob. It was straight down 1,000 feet. And we were told to jump. Now that was a leap in faith. I promised the Lord even then, if you get me out of this alive, I'll be a better Christian, a better chaplain, I promise, and I'll listen to you more. And believe me, that has not been an easy promise to keep because I'm still fallible so much. Did God bring me safely through just because I made that promise? Or was he going to do it anyway? Of course, he would have protected me, promise or no promise. All the time we were setting up our conditions, God says, I love you unconditionally. I will never leave you. I'm in control of the universe. Don't you know I want to take care of you? You don't have to bribe me with promises rooted in your fears. After the revelation of God's presence along the way, Jacob reached his mother's family and fell into the clutches of his uncle Laban. Now, Laban was not a really great guy. He was a big liar and cheated on Jacob. After spending 20 years there, Jacob had married Laban's 2 daughters, and he had 12 children by that time. Then God spoke to him again and said, go back to the land of your fathers and to your relatives, and I will be with you. So it was clearly God's time for him to go back home. But Jacob said, as afraid, this time Jacob was afraid that Laban would try to hinder him from leaving. So he took his family, his flocks, and possessions, and he ran away. He didn't even say goodbye. All because of fear. Just the same fear that drove him away from family when he stole the birthright, and now he's coming back with the same lie and fear. So you see his problem? Fear of man overpowered his fear and reverence for God. God had promised him to take him safely home, and he was obeying God by going back, but he couldn't trust God to handle the Laban situation. So therefore, instead of leaving behind a pleasant ending to their relationship, Laban and Jacob parted on a hostile, suspicious note, promising retaliation if either one harmed the other. Why does God let these things happen to his people? The answer is another spiritual principle, that we must learn to accept and live with trusting God knows what he's doing, and not let our fears take over that apprehension. God permits fearful circumstances even when we're doing his will. Many Christians have a misconception that if we're living to please God, nothing will touch our lives and make us afraid. That's wrong. Personal happiness is not what God has promised us. He gives us his joy. That's the deepest roots of our soul, which has its source in our relationship with him, and that pervades everything. He never guaranteed that our circumstances and relationships will not cause us stress and pain and fear. In fact, difficult situations are the very things that force us to rely on his presence and substitute fear of God for our fear of man. So let's talk about God's presence that calms fears. It's kind of the peak of what we're talking about here today. There's a direct correlation between God's presence and the absence of fear. When we put things we fear under his authority, those things lose their power over us, that terrorize us. We have to remind ourselves that everything that touches us is filtered through God's wisdom and love. We can trust him for the strength and protection that we really need. As for Jacob, he successfully got away from Laban, but another threat loomed in the distance. What about Esau? Did Esau still want to kill Jacob? How should he approach his estranged brother? God wanted Jacob's faith in him to grow. So he did something very special for him. And the book of Genesis continues. Jacob also went on his way, and the angels of God met him. When Jacob saw them, he said, "This is the camp of God." So angels were traveling with him, protecting him and his family. Wasn't God good to let him see these supernatural beings sent to quiet his fears and encourage his faith? This time, there'll be no running away. So Jacob sent word to his brother Esau that he was returning from his years with Laban. Bring him cattle and donkeys and sheep and goats and many servants. He said, I am sending this message to my Lord, that I may find favor in his eyes. We're talking about Esau here. So when the messengers returned from delivering Jacob's message, they said, quote, We went to your brother Esau, and now he is coming to meet you, and 400 men are with him. Whoa, 400 men? That amounted to a small army. And poor Jacob was terrified all over again. First, he made plans to protect at least half his possessions, so he had a plan B. Trusting God still came very hard for him, but he did remember to pray, and his prayer alternated between reminding God of his promises and expressing his own real fears. Jacob's prayer gives us a practical pattern to follow when we are afraid. Focus on God's promises, not on your fears. Moses aren't all that different from Jacob. And when we focus on our circumstances, we are often overwhelmed with fear. Instead, we should remember that God promises and pray them back to him. We can't tell him our fears, ask for his help, and tell him that we would trust him. We can do this. We can tell him, God, I'm shaking. God, I'm fearful. I don't understand this, but I believe in you because you promised me blah, blah, blah. See where I'm going with this. An example of that will be another humorous story about a 5-year-old Johnny who was in the kitchen as his mother was making supper. She asked him to go into the pantry and get a can of tomato soup, but he didn't want to go in alone. It's dark in there and I'm scared. She asked again and he persisted. Finally, she said, look, it's okay. Jesus will be in there with you. So Johnny walked hesitantly to the door and slowly opened it and peeked inside, saw it was really dark, and started to leave when all at once an idea came, and he said, Jesus, if you're in there, would you hand me a can of soup? Fear is an emotion. Trust is an act of will. Let me say it again. Fear is an emotion. Trust is an act of the will. Fear cancels out trust and vice versa. So let's finish off Jacob's story in our lesson today. Now, after this amazing encounter, Jacob's dependence on himself and his own devices would end. But old habits are hard to break. Instead of simply trusting the Lord and blessing him, Jacob divided his family in order of preference, just in case. Then he humbly approached his brother he had wronged and feared so terribly. And what did Esau do? Well, 33rd chapter, the 4th verse says this. Esau ran to meet Jacob and embraced him, threw his arms around his neck, and kissed him. A warm embrace and a kiss instead of a sword. It seemed that God had also worked on Esau's heart during the 20-year separation. Jacob had never needed to be afraid throughout that long journey at all. It hadn't been necessary for him to devise all those schemes to appease Esau, because Esau was no longer the enemy. But although Esau invited Jacob to come to his home and even offered to escort him there, Jacob still couldn't trust him. He even resorted to a little bit of underhandedness and continued his journey home without visiting Esau. So let's get to the point. The term fear not appeared more than 100 times in the Bible. That doesn't mean that there are no real or present dangers in our lives, things that are sensible to be fearful of. What it does mean is that God does not want us to be immobilized by fear. Instead, he wants us to trust his presence, his love, his protection, and his sovereignty over our fearful circumstances. He wants us to focus on his promises rather than on the circumstances that terrify us, no matter what they are. It makes no difference because God is bigger than that. He knows just what we can bear in our lives. He also knows how much each difficult situation will stretch us and deepen our faith in him. I close with a wonderful story that really brings us to the point of what I'm trying to say about fear. It's about a young violinist who lived in London. It's a true story, many years ago. He was a superb musician. He loved his music and enjoyed playing for small groups of people in the homes of friends. But he was deathly afraid of large crowds, so he avoided giving concerts. The thought of giving a concert such a large audience in a hall somewhere just terrified him. Well, the London music establishment was very critical of this young violinist. He was violating all the accepted protocols. According to the critics, excellent musicians were supposed to give public concerts in packed concert halls, and that was his job. In time, the criticism grew so intense that the young violinist finally relented. Even though it scared him terribly, he agreed to give one major concert. The largest concert in London was secured, and when the evening came, the hall was just packed. People were excited to hear this prodigy of this violinist. And so were the critics, who filled the first 3 rows, pad and pen in hand, ready to rake him over the coals. Well, the young violinist came out onto the stage and sat alone on a stool. He put his violin under his chin and played for an hour and a half. There was no music in front of him, no orchestra behind him, no breaks, just an hour and a half of beautiful violin music. After 10 minutes or so, many critics put down their pads and just listened to this wonderful man. They too were enraptured by the music of the young virtuoso. Well, after the performance, the crowd rose to its feet and began applauding wildly, and they just wouldn't stop. But the young violinist didn't acknowledge the applause. He just peered out into the audience as if he were looking for someone or something. So finally, he found what he was looking for. Relief just came over his face, and he began to acknowledge the cheers. Well, after the concert, the critics met the young violinist backstage, and they said, well, it was just as everyone was anticipating. They said, "You were wonderful. But one question, why did you take so long to acknowledge the applause of the audience?" The young violinist took a deep breath and answered, "You know, I was afraid of playing here, yet there was something I knew I needed to do. Tonight, just before I came on stage, I received word that my master, teacher, was to be in the audience. Throughout the concert, I tried to look for him, but I could not find him. So after I finished playing, I started to look more intently. I was so eager to find my teacher that I couldn't even hear the applause. I just had to know that he thought of what he thought of my playing. That was all that mattered. So finally I found him, high up in a balcony, and he was standing and applauding and with a big smile on his face. So after seeing him, I was finally able to relax. And I said to myself, if the master is pleased with what I have done, then everything else is okay. May God bless you. Fear not, for the fear of the Lord will take care of you. Bye.